Just for the record, Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to unduly delay the process, but if we're not going to strike the entire Section 2...
The one thing about it, Senator St. Nicholas, with all due respect, was you requested specifically upon closing on your opening discussion to come back and address one particular item, because you had utilized your time at that time, and I've been very liberal, very generous in terms of allowing ongoing discussion on this measure, because it's very critical that in fact the people of Guam understand exactly what is being proffered and what the legislature may act on, whether positively or negatively. And I viewed it to you and many of our colleagues. So I'm asking you to present an additional amendment so that we can hopefully conclude discussion on this measure.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to respectfully remind that it was your very statement that you made at the beginning of these proceedings when you said that you would have no problem with us trying to reinsert a legislatura back into this process. And
you're absolutely right, and I've been waiting for
the
amendment. Yes.
And those are the amendments that I'm seeking to proffer at this time, and there's a number of areas where I would like to reinsert a legislatura.
I did make a general statement, and it was applicable to also Speaker Cruz when he had brought that up as an issue. I said I will be open to any amendment that would insert or reinsert the involvement of the legislature and the governor's office. You are correct, Senator St. Nicholas. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So with that, I would first like to, since striking through on page 25 to page 26, line 17 was not ideal, I am concerned that the language on page 26, lines 11 to 17, at the very least, potentially open the door for that to be interpreted as a legislatura's way of saying that they are declaring that subject to the Organic Act interpretation, they are not necessarily, the legislatura does not necessarily need to be involved in the issuance of indebtedness. So in order to protect what may be over-interpreted as a legislatura relieving itself of the need to participate, I would like to request that we consider a strike-through on lines 11 to 17. Mr. Chairman.
Senators, the proposed amendment by Senator St. Nicholas is on page 26 to strike through the lines 11 and 17. Senator St. Nicholas, just for your information and the information of the members of the body, these very same provisions exist in GWA and GPA's mandate with regards to bond financing. So on that amendment, any discussion? Senator Espadon, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could just ask the mover of the amendment again why we would be deleting this section?
Senator St. Nicholas, if you would yield to the question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It has to do with a very unique way the Organic Act is written. Basically, Senator, the way the Organic Act is written is that all debt must come before the legislature, but the only debt that doesn't necessarily have to are bonds or other obligations of the government payable solely from revenues derived from any public improvement or undertaking that shall not be considered public indebtedness of Guam within the meaning of this section. So in other words, it's possible that revenue bonds may not necessarily need to be approved by legislatura. Now, the reason why all other revenue bonds from GPA or GWA still come back to us is because in that one section under the GITA statute, 50103K, Chapter 15, we are still required to approve the terms and conditions. So that's still catching those bonds. But what this Article 2 does in its entirety is by going to page 28, lines 5 to 13, we are stating that the authority may establish the terms and conditions. And so by keeping that language in there, making that declaration on page 26, in conjunction with the authorization for the authority to set the terms and conditions on page 28, the two combined would result in no requirement for a legislatura to receive and approve any bond, because we would have already in advance allowed for the authority to determine the terms and conditions, and we would have, through this declaration, affirmed that the Organic Act provision applies with respect to that difference and it basically punts everything over to the board and to the authority to be able to move forward in the debt market without the legislature's approval.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Mr. Chair, then the question I pose to you is that isn't that normal in other bond borrowings that other autonomous agencies have had to go through?
Senator Espadon, I did highlight it a little earlier that the same provision exists for GWA statute as well as GPA.
Right, and who knows? I may support this motion, but it seems to me, Mr. Chair, that the bigger issue seems to be an issue of trust, and maybe it's because of the whole YTK experience and perhaps some mismanagement in the past or whatever. But I think that seems to be the real central issue in all of this discussion, and why we're here 5-6 days later and still discussing it at this level, is because there seems to be perhaps an uneasiness, and I'll even say the word, and I said it earlier, a distrust of perhaps the boards, right, and maybe even the managers of some of these agencies. And so, you know, I guess I just kind of find it challenging to try to, how do you address the issues? Because when the present board is gone, there'll be a new board. And when the present manager is gone, there'll be a new manager. And the issue then becomes, as our colleagues have stated, they'd just really like to have it come before the legislature. And I believe that's what... And now, I'm not sure, you know, again, the reading of the Organic Act, Section 11 of the Organic Act, and I have it right in front of me, whether that interpretation that was proffered is really the same kind of interpretation I would take away from the language in this bill. I mean, it is hereby declared. I understand, you know, that the mover of the amendment earlier had said that that's strange language, and it is. I've never seen that either in any bill. It is hereby declared. But that's probably because it was written by someone other than somebody locally. That the system is and shall be a public improvement or undertaking as the term is used in the Organic Act. And we see that in the Organic Act. All indebtedness issued or entered into by the authority pursuant to Section 10203 shall be repayable only from the funds of the authority, available therefore and solely from revenues and systems, and will not be and shall not be deemed to be public indebtedness of Guam, as the term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act. What that tells me, bottom line, or at least what it's saying to me as I read that, is that if the authority is going to pay, like in this situation, pay back the bond in this situation from its own revenues, it is not a general obligation of the government. That's the way I interpreted this reading. And that's all I believe this is saying, that if the authority goes out and borrows and they're going to pay it from their own revenues, this is not an obligation of the government of Guam. That is consistent to what a revenue bond is. It's not a public indebtedness. It's a port indebtedness. It's an authority indebtedness. And so I'm not really sure... Again, and I highly respect and appreciate the sentiments of the mover of this amendment, because he's trying very diligently to try to make sure that the interests of the people are definitely protected and that the legislature has a say in the bond borrowing going forward. But by striking this section, that to me reads that if the port is going to go borrow and they're going to use their own revenues, then it's not an obligation of the government, it's an obligation of the port. It has no relevance then to the argument that the legislature is being taken out of the process. And again, I say that with all due respect to the mover of the amendment. But logically, that's the way I see this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator Torres, on the amendment.
The prior speaker brought up a lot of the concerns I had. Generally, what I see happening here is by removing this, then arguably this becomes a government debt and it affects the debt ceiling ratio. And secondly, it also calls into question the pledge and the repayment of this loan. Then the government is directly tied into it. But the question that I want to pose to Gita is, if this were to be delete it from the bill, lines 1 through 17, would the effect per the Organic Act be implied? So even though it is not implicitly spelled out here, would it be implied, and will it have really no effect if we take it out?
Thank you, Senator. If we take it out, and because it was used previously, then bond counsel will not allow us to imply that it's there. Because again, we made the statement previously, and by us taking it out, he cannot make the same statement.
But by the nature of taking out a revenue bond, you know, those implications come with a revenue bond. And I'm just trying to find the thread, because I do know that, you know, without this very specific language, then other implications can be made. But then again, if you're selling a revenue bond is a revenue bond. It's not a general obligation bond, so it would come with all the terms and conditions of that bond, and that's what the nature of those bonds. And that's why I'm trying to see if it in fact is not as, it would not have such an impact if it were taken out.
Again, because we had it in others, in power and water, that statement specifically, they will not imply, and future legislatures, and because the bond is long-term, that's why I'm saying it will have an impact on our credit process. Because again, by taking it out, when we tried to put it in, it brings interest rate risk, I guess, wonderment of something in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask one of my lawyer friends. There's a legal term for that. If it's not in, there's some implication about if it's left out, it's specifically excluded. If it's put in, it's specifically provided for. So I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Senator Esteves on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with some of the readings, and I concur that if we were to remove this provision, that it could be considered part of the total public indebtedness. And you see a couple redundancies in this bill with regards to Guam not being liable for this indebtedness, and a lot of references to things that are in current statute, as well as references to the Organic Act. And I think it's just important to note that this measure is not just specifically written for us. While we may be very aware of Guam statutes, the Organic Act, and other things that apply, I mean, it's my belief that an investor doesn't know in intricate detail the laws and statutes and enabling legislation of Guam. And that's why we're going to see so many redundancies in this bill, because as they formulate the bond and the promises and covenants, whatever is referenced via current statute, and then anything else that's there as other provisions and other pledges to the investor. So even though I think and I concur with the interpretation of this, I think the notion that it might already be implied with regards to having this in there, I can see the argument, and I think it's worthy to note that I think it's a fair argument that the investor might not know that it's necessarily implied under the Organic Act of Guam, and having the redundancies in there so that their legal teams can review it and know exactly where to go to confirm this, to give the investor the warm and fuzzy, I think is absolutely essential. So I do not support the amendment. I think it's important to have this in here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. We're going to call for the vote after the closing remarks by Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Senator San Nicolas, I'm sorry. Senator Nelson on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify what we are looking to delete is lines 11 through 17 on page 26. And it reads, "It is hereby declared that the system is and shall be a public improvement or undertaking as the term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act, subsection 1423 alpha, Title 48 U.S. Code." And that reads, "Scope of legislative authority bonding, which in regards to Guam Power Authority refinancing, The legislative power of Guam shall extend to all rightful subjects of legislation not consistent with the provisions of this chapter and the laws of the United States applicable to Guam, taxes and assessment on property, internal revenue, sales, license, fees, and royalties for franchises, privileges, and concessions may be imposed for the purpose of the government of Guam as may be uniformly provided by the legislature of Guam and when necessary to anticipate tax and revenues. And then it goes further on to read, back to the bill, all indebtedness issued or entered into by the authority pursuant to this in subsection 10203, which is basically within this code or within this bill chapter, shall be repayable only from funds of the authority available therefore or solely from the revenues of the system, and therefore will not be and shall not be deemed to be public indebtedness of Guam as that term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act. I believe what's really in question is the last line, therefore will not be and shall not be deemed to public indebtedness of Guam as that term is used in Section 11 of the Organic Act, which means that perhaps there's a concern here about if the Section 11 of Organic Act shows that the legislature has the power and subjects of legislation to be not consistent with provisions, that this is removing the legislative power from this bill itself. And I think that's the matter of question here, not whether the revenue is going to be affected, whether it's going to be a revenue bond or a general obligation bond. But I think maybe we should get further clarification from legal to see if this is really the case before we move on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson, for your suggestion. Senator San Nicolas, you would like to close on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I take umbrage with the assertion from the GITA representative that this is somehow going to present a credit risk. The determination of whether or not a bond is going to be a general obligation bond or a revenue bond is not pre-decided in the statute that authorizes the entity to go out and borrow. It is decided in the legislation that authorizes the indenture. It's decided in the terms and conditions that gets passed by this body when the bill comes before us for us to be able to say, yay or nay, go ahead and go forward and borrow, and these are the terms and conditions. It's a general obligation, or it's a limited obligation, or it's a revenue bond. You don't write that into the enabling statute unless you're trying to set the system up for pre-approval. It was stated earlier, Mr. Chairman, that the involvement of Legislatura is somehow rooted in distrust down at the port, and that is absolutely not the case. My concern is that, as was stated numerous times, even just a few minutes ago, this rewrite is based upon the Guam Waterworks Authority enabling statute. But GWA has elected representation in the form of the CCU. The people are still involved in the process. We are not including the people in this process by mirroring the GWA borrowing statutes. The question was raised, if we left this out, would it in any way affect our ability to go out into the bond market? That is entirely untrue. Because if we do go out into the bond market, as we are advising to do so in Section 3, all we would need is future legislation similar to that effect, spelling out the terms and conditions that we're willing to go out and borrow for. What this section does by including it in the Article 2 for the port is it's basically, as was mentioned by the retiring speaker, it's a declaratory statement by this body that we acknowledge the fact that revenue bonds do not need legislative approval. And by revenue bonds not needing legislative approval, the only remaining protection is actually local statute in GITA that requires us to approve the terms and conditions. But again, I reiterate, on page 28, we hand over the authority to approve terms and conditions to the board, who can delegate that to the Port Authority. So if we keep this section here on page 26, lines 11 to 17, and we keep on page 28, lines 5 to 13, there is no requirement for them to come back here. If we do not remove this page 26, lines 11 to 17, if we keep that in there, we are acknowledging that we are, so long as it's a revenue bond, the port does not need to come back here if they want to borrow. Organically, we will be reaffirming that we understand that they can only borrow revenue bonds. You don't need to come back here. And the only remaining protection would be local statute, because we would have, by declaring this, made it very clear that any bond measure that they're entertaining is within the context of that exemption in the Organic Act that precludes revenue bonds from needing legislative approval. That's what this section does. If we take this out, we can still, in any future indentures, include in their very clear language that this is a revenue bond, it's not a general obligation bond, it is not public indebtedness. That is where we include that language in future legislation to authorize borrowing. But by putting it as the gatekeeper for any debt that's considered by the port, where we are in effect pre-approving or pre-declaring that yes, all of your debt is only going to be revenue bonds, and that technically would cause that section of the Organic Act to result in us not needing to approve it, provided that we also give you approval for your terms and conditions, which we do pre-approve on page 28, lines 5 to 13. And so, in the context of trying to make sure that if this is somehow a mirror of the Guam Waterworks Authority enabling statute, we still involve the people of Guam by involving the legislatura, by making sure that we are not in advance saying that any bonds that the port floats are going to be within the context of the exception as provided in the Organic Act to exclude the legislature from the process. So I humbly ask my colleagues to please support the striking of lines 11 to 17. We can always make sure that language is included in any indentures that come before this body with respect to the port, and that will suffice to be able to make sure that there is no general obligations being incurred by the people on any future port debt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas, for staying within the time allotment. Senator Mary, you have a point of information, and then we're going to call the vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The thought that I was looking for in terms of legal construction was the term called canon of statutory construction. And in considering that, in terms of the statute as a whole, my position that therefore is that it is a necessary component of the statute that we include this in there to make it absolutely clear what it is and how it's to be addressed. So in terms of canon of statutory construction, it's one of those components. I talk about components in the bigger picture that is necessary to make the statute in its entirety, in its wholeness, in fact, whole and clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Torres, for your point of information. A call for the vote on the proposed amendment by Senator St. Nicholas to delete lines 11 to 17, page 26. Vice Speaker Talai, do you have a point of information or?
Yes, I guess it's a point of inquiry.
Yes.
It sounded like from the amendment that this language is valuable if we place it in Section 3 of the bill. And that would be very on point and consistent with what GITA needs, what we would like to see, and not preclude anything. So.
Thank you for your point of information or inquiry. On the proposed amendment by Senator St. Nicholas, there's been an objection. All those in favor of the proposed amendment, please signify by raising your hand. Five. Amendment fails. We are going to proceed to Vice Speaker Talahi. I know that in your opening discussion you requested to have an opportunity to revert back to your definition of system.
Mr. Chairman,
Vice Speaker Talahi.
If I could ask, I'd like an opportunity to proffer amendments as well. I know we're going round two. Some of us have.
I yield.
This is in direct relation to the original opening statement that she provided. She requested that, in fact, we as a committee come back and address an issue she brought up with the definition of system. So that's why we are coming to entertain her. And if you have a amendment, please prepare it and ensure it's written. Vice Speaker Talai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I passed out an amendment, so I'll give everybody a little while to find it. It says it's for page 40, line 22. Beginning on line 22, page 40. That's what the top of this amendment says.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Senator St. Nicholas, state your point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to be recognized that I had the floor, but I suppose that the chair is having me yield to Vice Speaker.
We are reverting to other senators, and then if by any chance you have any final amendment, then I'll come back to you,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr.
That's
Chairman.
fine, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you.
I would let him finish.
No,
Oh,
Vice
no,
Speaker
I
Talai,
yield.
you have the
I
floor at the
yield.
moment. Yeah.
All right, on the amendment. If you will recall, I made an amendment earlier to delete the entire subsection D on page 40. Subsection D is a covenant that we are allowing to be put into this indenture that will be in place for 30 years that says that the legislature or any authority is not allowed to transfer any additional non-system operating responsibilities or other unfunded mandates to the authority without providing for the payment of the costs, with the exception of COLA and supplemental annuity. I have no objection to the exceptions. I like the exceptions. I think they highlight the importance of this subsection D. This is the type of language in previous indentures that has prevented cooperation by government of Guam, autonomous agencies, with the entire government of Guam. And because we are the legislature charged with taking care of the entire government of Guam, I hate to see this put into the indenture. But my amendment failed to remove that, but I would at the very least ask my colleagues to please consider adding another exception. So, and it would read, and with the exception that the authority shall collaborate fully with the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency and other local law enforcement and regulatory agencies.
Vice Speaker Talai, let me stand by,
Sorry?
please. Senators, do you have a copy of the amendment? Okay, 1 minute recess. Committee in the whole is now reconvened. Vice Speaker Talai, on your proposed amendment, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was saying, subsection D on page 40 will preclude for the next 30 years, as long as this bond survives, it's going to preclude any additional, the legislature or anyone, but really the legislature from transferring any additional operating responsibilities to the authority. And I'm very concerned with this language. I feel like this is the root of many of the perplexities in our trying to take care of the entire government of Guam, that we are prevented by bond covenants from moving forward or for asking autonomous agencies to assist in that regard. So I'm asking my colleagues to, at the very least, consider another exception in addition to COLA and supplemental annuities that the port would also be responsible for. And so the language that I'm proposing to add, Mr. Chair, is, and with the exception that the authority shall collaborate fully with the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency and other local law enforcement and regulatory agencies to facilitate the inspection and prevention of illegal entry into Guam of potentially unlawful immigrants or items or invasive species by or through any works, property, and facilities owned, operated, or leased by the authority, and to facilitate the protection of coral, wildlife, and biodiversity in Apra Harbor. And of course, I acknowledge fully that the port has been responsible in these areas. It has been very cooperative to date. And I think we're very lucky that the port general manager right now is a former EPA director, and so she's very aware of these types of responsibilities. But as I said earlier, this bond covenant that we are approving, that we're proposing to approve today, is going to be in place for 30 years. And so I just want to ensure that while I would hope that they would be allowed to do these things, I don't want a bond indenture to prevent the general manager or the Port Authority Board, who is really going to be the ones making any decisions up there, from remembering that this is part of what the government of Guam expects of them and what the government of Guam is very much trusting to them to do. The board does not have to decide how to take care of, drugs on Guam. The legislature of Guam, together with all the agencies, GPD and Homeland Security, all the agencies, we've got to coordinate them all. And so that's what I'm trying to do here, is just to make sure that that opportunity remains open, Mr. Chair, and that we don't get precluded by some kind of indenture from doing any of those things. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. There's a proposed amendment on the floor, as was read by the Vice Speaker. And Senators, in this particular case, the chair will rule that, in fact, this is non-germane to the proposed legislation, specifically because of the impact that it has on the mandate associated with the Port Authority of Guam.
Mr. Chair, point of information.
Yes, Senator Nelson. Please state your point of information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just give me a second.
Your point of information, Senator Nelson?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair. In the Port Authority of Guam financial statements, additional information, and independent auditors report, September 30, 2016 and 2015, on page 38, it states, Governments of Guam General Fund in March 2011. I'll read the whole thing, but what I want to focus on, I'll come to later. Received $12.2 million invoiced to the government of Guam's DOA, representing an annual assessment of $875,000 for each of the fiscal years in 1998 to 2011. Pursuant to 5 GCA Chapter 22, Section 22421, transfer of autonomous agency revenues to Autonomous Agency Collections Fund. In May 2011, the authority requested DOA further review the assessment, as the authority believes that it does not owe the entire $12.25. On previous transfers in 94 and 97 of $500,000 and $3.5 to the general fund and to the government of Guam Autonomous Agency Infrastructure Collection Fund, respectively. The authority also asserts that it funds certain government services provided by the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency, the Guam Environmental Protection Agency, the Guam Police Department, and the Guam Fire Department through ongoing operations at the port. Contributes to GITA and Ports-Based Realignment and Closure Commission and will fund the Tri-Star Pipeline and Waterline projects in the future. Further, the authority understands that it is only required to transfer amounts to the AAICF when there's an operating surplus. So I think this is very germane, Mr. Chair, because we have seen in the airport's bond covenant that they are limited to what they can fund certain government services. And we see it when we see Customs and Quarantine trying to make ends meet.
Senator Nelson, you did state your point of information. We're not debating the issue at the moment. So the chair has ruled, unless there's a motion to override the decision of the chair, I will entertain that motion at this time if anyone is willing to proffer that. You're talking about exceptions. Come on, folks. Senator Talai, your motion or your
Mr.
amendment
Chair,
has been ruled ingermane.
As we pointed
Non-germane
out
to the
previously, a sua sponte ruling by the chair as to Mr. Chair, yes, I would
Any other
move to
discussion?
overrule you because you in your legislation have included an exception. This is another exception. No one expected that we would have to write an exception into this bill so that they were going to pay their own annuities or their own COLA.
I am sorry.
And
Vice
no one
Speaker
would
Talai.
think we need to put it in writing that we're going to take care of at the port, you know.
Vice Speaker Talai, do you have a motion on the floor to overrule the
I am making
decision
that.
of the chair?
That's
Okay.
what I am talking about,
There's a
Mr.
motion
Chair.
on the
I am
floor
not finished.
to overrule the decision of the chair. Senator Talai, on that motion, you're recognized.
It is very germane to this bill. This bill, although the title says it is to pass a revenue bond, it's actually to increase the autonomy of the ports board at the expense of the ability of the people of Guam to review and set policy for the Port Authority of Guam. What types of economic activity we're going to embrace in the next 30 years, and what type of responsibilities, such as annuities and COLA, that the port is going to take care of in the next 30 years. It sets it at this point in time. And while I think the port understands that it is there to help us to take care of crime in our homes, that because we've seen it with other bonds, we need to put it in writing today, Mr. Chair. It is relevant because it cannot. That's the problem. It can't be relevant in any other bill after today. After we allow this indenture, we prevent the legislature from going in and saying anything else about the board. We prevent the legislature from giving them any other duty. And I hope they embrace that this is their duty, but as you said, it's not in writing, so this is the time to put it down, because if it's not germane today, you preclude it from being done for the next 30 years. And this is something, this is basic. This is, do we allow drugs through the port? Is it part of the port's responsibility to help us prevent drugs from coming into the port or not? Is it part of the port's responsibility to help us and all of our agencies prevent invasive species? The people of Guam cannot understand how we can't stop invasive species. And this is, you think they're going to understand after
Vice
today
Speaker
why
Talahi,
the legislature
can
can't
you please remain
construct something down there at the
with
port
the motion that is on the floor?
to actually fumigate
Vice Speaker
and
Talai, can you please
physically prevent
stay
invasive species?
with
They're
the
not going to
motion that you have
understand that
proffered?
we've precluded that today in the guise of, well, let's rush to the market and give them authority to borrow $72 million at this rate. We've actually given them way more than that, Mr. Chair. And
Vice
by
Speaker
your
Talai.
telling us that this is not even germane to add into the bill, I can't see why, or who, anybody in here, why would they think that that should be done? This is a very minimal actual impact. I'm not even mandating, I'm asking them to collaborate with our local law enforcement agencies, environmental protection, and regulatory agencies. That's it. Collaborate.
Thank you, Vice Speaker Talai. Your time's
Thank you,
up.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the motion to overrule the decision of the chair? Speaker Cruz.
I join in the motion to overrule, and I ask for a roll call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On the motion to overrule the decision of the chair, there's been a request for roll call. There's been a second request for roll call. We're going to call for the vote. There's been 2 requests for roll call, insufficient to meet the 3 threshold. Senators, on the proposed motion or on the motion to overrule the decision of the chair, all those in favor of the motion to overrule the decision of the chair with regards to the non-germaneness of
Point
this
of order,
particular
Mr.
amendment.
Chair. There were 3 calls for roll call.
Before the gavel, Mr. Chair.
One minute recess. Good afternoon, Senators. The Committee of the Whole is now hereby reconvened. I will acknowledge the third request for a roll call on the question whether, in fact, the body wishes to overrule the decision of the chair on the germaneness of the proposed amendment by Vice Speaker Talai. Clerk, roll call.
Senator Atta. Senator Atta, aye. Senator Uggan.
Aye.
Senator Uggan, nay. Senator Castro. Senator Castro, nay. Speaker Cruz. Speaker Cruz, aye. Senator Espaldon. Senator Espaldon, aye. Senator Estevez. Senator Estevez, aye. Senator Lee. Senator Lee, excused. Senator Morrison. Senator Morrison, nay. Senator Munya. Senator Munya, nay. Senator Nelson. Senator Nelson, aye. Senator Rodriguez. Senator Rodriguez, excused. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Augustine, nay. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, pass. Vice Speaker Terlahi. Vice Speaker Terlahi, aye. Senator Torres. Senator Torres, aye. Senator San Nicolas. Senator San Nicolas, aye.
On the previous question presented to the body, 8 yeas, 5 nays, and 2 absent. The motion to overrule the decision of the chair hereby passes. Vice Speaker Talai, you still have the floor on your amendment.
I think I've concluded my opening on that amendment.
Any further
Thank you.
discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Nelson and then Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to proffer an amendment to the amendment.
You may proceed.
Thank you. I would like to include, I'm just going to read it, and with the exception that the authority shall collaborate and include the words fully, including, but not limited to the provision of space for the Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency. So I am adding to the amendment, fully including but not limited to the provision of space.
There's a proposed amendment to the amendment to insert the words after fully, including but not limited to the provision of space. On the secondary amendment, any discussion? If no discussion, we're going to call for the vote. All those in favor of the secondary amendment, please signify by raising your hand. Or any objections? No objections? So ordered. On the primary amendment as amended. Any further discussion on the primary amendment being presented? No further discussion. Senator Nelson, Vice Speaker Talai, did you want to close?
I just want to thank my colleagues for their consideration of this. I want to acknowledge that the port's current, they have been very cooperative with agencies. They have allowed the fire department to establish a station over at the marina. They've allowed customs to operate right at the port facilities, and I think that I want to see this collaboration continue, and I very much thank my colleagues for considering this and to allowing. And I am very afraid that after today, if we pass this bill, the indentures will prevent us from allowing such collaboration. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker Talai. On the proposed amendment, any objections? No objection on the amendment? So ordered. Senator Esteves, you have an amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I passed out an amendment with regards, and there's been a lot of discussion about, and again, I've concurred many times that there are no fiduciaries or elected members involved in future borrowing aspects of the Port Authority Board. With that, Mr. Chairman, I propose an amendment to line 1, page 26. And that line is to read, the board, comma, through the agency of GIDA, comma, with approval from the legislature in Guahan, and then continues on, may at any time, my apologies, right here, may at any time or from time to time authorize the authority to incur indebtedness. So it's just inserting approval from the legislature, which is consistent with current law under Chapter 50, Title 12, GCA 50103K with GIDA. So it's not inconsistent with current law, but it does apply that specific aspect to this bill. So it just reinforces the nature that the legislature does have the authority and should be the improving body with regards to any indebtedness. So it does add that factor and ensure that factor is always maintained, that an elected body, a duly elected body, has oversight over any debt incurred, whether an autonomous agency or not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. On the proposed amendment by Senator Esteves, any further discussion? No further discussion. Senator San Nicolas, on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the amendment. I do have an amendment to the amendment. And what I would like to recommend is after the word Guahan, we add the words in addition to this article. After the word Guahan, we add in addition to this article. So it would read the board through the agency of GIDA with approval from the legislature in Guahan in addition to this article. And the reason why I recommend we add that, Mr. Chairman, is because in this article we're granting authorities to the board already. By adding that language, we're making it very clear that it is required that our approval must be above and beyond what's being granted in this article, in this new Article 2.
On the amendment to insert the words after Guahan in addition to this article, any discussion? Any objections? No objections? So ordered. On the primary amendment as amended, Senator Esteves, would you like to close?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I thank the previous speaker for that addition to this amendment. Again, there's been a lot of discussion with regards to oversight, and there are many points. I really think this is a fair compromise. This does not take away this leaves intact about 99% of the authority of the board of the port. But with regards to the fiduciary responsibility and looking out for the fiduciary aspect of the people of Guam, it's very important that the legislature is involved. And Mr. Chairman, this ensures that the legislature is involved and is the final authority on any borrowing, the same way they had to come down here today. So I think it's a simple question, as you would any banker. If you want to borrow money off of the backs of the taxpayers, you have to come to this House, and I think it sets a very good precedent. So I ask my colleagues for the support on this amendment and ask them for their vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. On the proposed amendment, no objections. So ordered. Any final amendments for Bill 157-34? Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized. Senators, please, as you proffer your amendments, ensure that the proffered language is forwarded to the clerks so that, in fact, it's properly recorded. Thank you. Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 28, line 6, after the word authority, I'd like to add the language, I'd like to make a motion to amend and add the language, subject to approval from the legislature in Guahan in addition to this article. Page 28, line 6, after the word authority. Add the word subject to approval from the legislature in Guahan in addition to this article.
Senator San Nicolas, on your amendment, would you like to discuss it further?
Again, Mr. Chairman, this is just to serve as an additional safeguard that we are not stating that the authority can go out and use those terms and conditions to proceed with securing an indenture unless it's approved by the legislature beyond the approvals that are being already provided in this redraft of Article 2.
On the amendment by Senator San Nicolas, on page 28, line 6, after the word authority, insert subject to approval by legislature in Guahan in addition to this article, and then continue with that particular statement. Any further discussion? No further discussion, Senator San Nicolas. Did you want to close? On the amendment by Senator San Nicolas, no objections? So ordered. Any other amendment, final amendment for Bill 157-34?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to discuss, starting on page 39 and going into page 40, from a different perspective, the pledge by the government of Guam. I know that we've made some amendments there. Just to clarify, I remember earlier in the week there was a motion to strike certain provisions of this section. Did that amendment pass, and are certain provisions of section 10229 on page 39 stricken?
I believe the phrases on page 25, clerk, please clarify if in fact is necessary. On page 39, line 25, the phrase starting with in order, all the way to the top of page 40, authority, was deleted. By the body. Senator San Nicolas, you still have the floor.
From line 25 beginning in the words in order to mirror, all the way to page 40 ending in the words...
And concluding with the word authority. Line 1.
Line 1. Waterworks Authority?
Yes, Guam Waterworks Authority. Just so that we can verify this, 1 minute recess. Committee in the whole is now back in order. Senator San Nicolas, based on the information I disseminated to you, that's correct. It was previously deleted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the clerk.
I appreciate that amendment as it was a what I would view as an extraneous reference, but on page 40, starting on lines 10 to 15, I think that we just need to really understand what we're saying here in this section. Now, the overall section means that the government of Guam is pledging to the bondholders certain things. And by virtue of this pledge, nothing can happen outside of these things. And so part of what's being pledged is to protect the exclusive right of the authority to operate or maintain within Guam any system operated by the government or its designees by preventing the acquisition, operation, maintenance, or permitting of any instrumentality of the government or any other public or private agency, entity, or person to operate a separate and competitive system. Now, I'm just concerned, would something like this prohibit us from perhaps privatizing a maintenance contract or privatizing management of a certain division, like if we wanted to have a certain marina privatized or entered into a public-private partnership. And the reason why I just wanted to bring this up is because once these things are written into an indenture, there's no turning back. And I'm not saying that I want to pursue any of these things, but I do want it to be very clear that while we may legislate certain things, once it's written into an indenture, it cannot be undone. And the way this entire Article 2 is written by pledging the whole system, and by thereafter pledging that the exclusive right of the authority will be in this regard, once that's written into the indenture, that's it. And I just raise that concern because, for example, we have seen up at the airport, some people have talked about certain revenue-generating ideas, like perhaps a departure fee, for example, or not charging customs rent and plowing that $3 million back into the agency. But because of the covenants that are written into the airport's commitments, not even this legislative body can supersede that. There's some debate as to whether or not that is in fact true, but to date, we have been stuck. And I'm just concerned that once we authorize those kinds of limitations to be written into an indenture, a future legislative body 30 years from now, 20 years from now, may want to consider certain things, but we would be unable to because the indenture at that time will thereafter prohibit it. So I just wanted to raise the point that this body needs to be very clear that from lines 10 to 15, we are protecting the exclusive right of the authority to operate or maintain within Guam any system operated by the government or its designees by preventing acquisition, operation, maintenance, or the permitting of any instrumentality of the government or any public or private agency, entity, or person to operate a separate and competitive system. That's pretty broad. I wanted to raise that, and I wanted to yield to perhaps any input that my colleagues may have on that concern. I may be over-interpreting it, but I would like to yield to the wisdom of the body, Mr. Chairman.
So it's a general statement, or is there a motion?
I'd like to raise the concern and yield to the body if anybody may have any input, because that's how I'm looking at it, and depending on what input my colleagues may have, I may ask for a recess for further discussion, or maybe make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nicholas. On the inquiry or request by the senator for any comments on this particular section, Senator Esteves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a different excuse me, reading of this section, and I think it's very, I think it could be a very important section for as an investor. And the exclusive right of the authority, so it says operate or maintain within Guam, which basically is a pledge that we're not going to get in the way of their operation. So they have a governing board, they have an authority that we're not going to go in there and say, hey, Port Authority, you know, you're taking every Friday off, you're taking every Saturday off, and you're closed because we just decide that, you know, these are the days that we're going to have off in Gulf Guam, for example, something extreme. But it just applies a protection that we're not going to get into the micromanaging of their specific day-to-day operations that can affect their viability and ability to generate revenue. Other than that, further reading, maintain, so if they need to do upgrades and stuff that we're not getting in the way, so as they operate their system. The other aspect, government or its designees by preventing the acquisition, I think as could be interpreted in many different ways, but I view that as we're not going to try to sell or privatize the Port Authority of Guam other than autonomy. other than them running as an autonomous agency as an effort to either get money into the general coffers. So I think that guarantee is important. Not preventing them or precluding them from actually operating, as previously stated. Not getting in their way of maintaining their facility, not getting in the way of permitting any of the instrumentalities or other public-private entities, again, from operating. So if you look at that, to operate a separate and competitive system. So it kind of gives also exclusivity. So basically, the way I'm understanding it, Mr. Chairman, and I'm reading it, is, for example, let's say you were a larger instrumentality or a municipality. Let's say this bond was for the hospital. You know, we're not going to have two competing systems, basically, which in turn, we really have one port. We really have one water system. We don't have multiple sources providing power to the grid. We don't have multiple competitors providing water to the system. We don't have multiple ports providing competitive sources. So this allows for the exclusive right for the authority to maintain their position where they are right now at the time of the bond indenture, with all with the rights reserved for them as per this statute and their enabling legislation with regards to operations. That's how I look at it. But I do think it's very important to have this in here, because if I were an investor and I'm looking at that, I wouldn't want any crazy changes to potentially happen, and a pledge might make me feel a little bit better before risking my money if I were going to invest that. You know, you're not going to just decide to sell it. You're not just going to decide to do anything out of the ordinary, and it's going to be business as usual as to the best of your ability. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Any other discussion on that particular sub-item C on page 40? Senator Torres,
Just
as requested by one of our colleagues.
very briefly, I think that it's a necessary component to keep in there, because what we want to ensure is that when you invest in something that you don't have the revenue stream that is necessary to ever be compromised by allowing a competitive system to come in and erode that revenue stream that would otherwise be yours. So I don't see any harm. I mean, it's a logical thing if you're going into it, and when you're a government in a very finite area like ours, that you would want to secure the revenue stream by being the monopoly on that one system. The same way with the airport. It's understood, and it's reasonable, I would think.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Any further discussion on that particular subsection? Senator Baudon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chair, I kind of agree with all parties. You know, in fact, the initial, our colleague who brought it up more to bring it to our attention is wondering if there's any concern that we should have with this paragraph, and the two succeeding speakers kind of said, well, it's probably necessary to put it in for the security of the investors, so that they feel confident that what they're investing in, there's not going to be any transfer of any, of any of the system that the Port Authority has. But this paragraph seems to address two different things, and that's where maybe the concern should arise. And the very first several words, to protect, the government's going to protect, or we will pledge, to protect the exclusive right of the authority to operate or maintain within Guam any system operated by the government or its designees. That language in itself, I'm not sure that by granting the exclusive right to the Port Authority to maintain and operate within Guam any system operated by the government or its designees, by preventing the acquisition, operation, maintenance, or permitting of any instrumentality of the government. And so it even goes even broader past the scope of, I think, of what the authority's power is. And so why are we pledging on behalf of the port, or at least how are we protecting the exclusive right of the authority by pledging that any acquisition, operation, maintenance, or permitting of any instrumentality, not just the port, but any instrumentality throughout the government of Guam, or any other public or private agency, entity, or person to operate a separate and competitive system, I'm not sure how that really protects the exclusive right of the authority, all the succeeding language, because it goes from a very specific to protect the exclusive right of the authority to preventing the acquisition or operation of any instrumentality, any operation. In other words, if there's a move to privatize other areas in the government, this prohibits it. I mean, that's what it seems to me. And it's not really relevant to the exclusive right of the authority to operate and maintain its system down at the port. So there's two different things that are being discussed in this one paragraph, and I'm not sure they're related. And so I think there should be at least a little bit of concern of what this is really saying, because we want to protect the exclusive right of the authority to operate, but by not allowing any part of the government or any instrumentality of the government of Guam, whether it's Parks and Recs, whether it's busing over at DPW, to be privatized. And I think those are two different subjects. And again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm reading it that way. And so I just want to make that comment. And I've been trying to understand what the concern might be, because it does seem that something like this should be in a bond covenant. But again, it might be way beyond what the Port Authority has the ability. I mean, we're pledging something that's not really totally relevant to the port operations itself when it comes to the borrowing that the port needs. And that's where I'm a little confused and concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadan. That concludes the discussion on an inquiry on from some of our colleagues. Senator Nicholas, are you fine with that? Senator Nelson? On the item C?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the previous speaker for noting that. I'm looking at the Airport Authority Bond Covenant, and here in the covenant, the pledge and assignment of revenues, it always specifically states the airport, and it is very true. This is the bill that we're looking at now. It goes outside of the scope of the authority of the port, and so I just want to reiterate it. Please read the covenants that they have been referring to, that Gita has referred to, because really we need to analyze the services of the agency that they gave us before the covenant, and now the limitations for them to serve the people of Guam after the covenants were agreed to. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Yes, Senator Esteves.
Just real quick, Mr. Chairman. I know it's very, very wordy, but if you were to and there's a lot of ors and other options, but if you were to just break it down into very simple sentence construction, action where to protect the exclusive right of the authority. One, it ends. To protect the exclusive right, how is it doing it? By preventing. Forget all the list. We can almost semantics, but by preventing. Then the last portion. To operate a separate and competitive system. Mr. Chairman, unless somebody is going to have a competitive port or a competitive marina through either another government agency that's going to actually compete and say, you know what, the Port Authority charges this, but we're going to charge this, Mr. Chair.
Point of
Senator
information.
Esteves, Senator Nelson, do you want to state your point of information?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the reconstructing of the paragraph and the section. However, in a legalized issue, you have to look at the content as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I understand, Mr. Chair.
Senator
What I'm trying to
Esteves,
get
you still have
at
the floor.
is, at the end of the day, if it doesn't qualify as a separate and competitive system, in terms of the definition of system, which is talking about marinas, boats, waterways, as long as it's not competing with the port, it's not going to be a problem. And I don't think we have any intention to have a competing port. I don't think we have any intention of having a competing marina. all of the systems right now belong to the port, as has been established. And unless we're going to have something competing against it, I don't think any of this is going to actually have an effect on how other government agencies operate. Because whether the fire department is operating out of the port through an agreement, which we had already passed that amendment, they're not competing with the port in any way. There's no competition for revenue streams with that regard, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Senator Espadon, there's really no motion on the floor, amendment on the floor.
But I just
there
want
was
to
a request by our colleague to see if he can get some insight from
But
others. So yes,
I
Senator
appreciate that. But I just want to state for the record, because I noticed some concerns earlier, and I did say, correct me if I'm wrong, and I was basically given a new perspective by our legal counsel, which I really appreciate, that perhaps I was reading it too broadly. So I basically withdraw those concerns at this point and kind of really side with the sentiments of our colleagues who says this probably is an important part to be included in the bond covenant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. Any further discussion on the legislation? I know, Senator St. Nicholas, you had inquired about our colleagues, their position on that particular subsection, but you haven't proffered any amendment, so...
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, in the context of the discussion, you know, this specific section, subsection C, speaks to any system. And again, we go back to the definition of system. And if you look at the end of the definition of system on page 24, it not only speaks to the port and its various components, but the system also includes those that are owned and or operated by the authority or its contractors, agents, or subcontractors. Now, I just want to make sure that by including this language, we are not going to be, if it's written into an indenture, committing this government to deny the permit of any private agency to be able to do business on this island because it is a competing contractor, agent, or subcontractor of the port. In other words, if the port already has an existing maintenance contract, would we, by virtue of this, including it under the definition of system, be unable to, or would we technically be violating a covenant in a bond if we were to permit a competing maintenance company that was not an existing contractor or subcontractor of the port? I just want to make sure that we're not overreaching by the confluence of language where the definition of system is so broad and the application of system in this subsection is so broad that we run the risk of it being written into an indenture that thereafter becomes a contractual obligation of this government that we cannot even legislatively reverse. Because under the definition of system, system means all, and then it goes on a whole long list, and then it ends with the contractors, agents, or subcontractors of the authority. So it also includes whatever private contracts they have in place. If this is written into the indenture, we won't be able to permit anything that may not grant those contractors some kind of exclusive right. Just wanted to raise the concern, Mr. Chairman, because these are broad. This is a broad definition, a very broad definition of system, and then this is a very broad authorization to write into an indenture. And if we lock it up for 30 years and it turns out to be something we didn't intend, we're going to be told we can't go back because it's a bond covenant and we will violate the bonds and we will sink the government's credit rating and there's no way we can do this. I'm sorry, you're stuck for 30 years. So I'm just concerned, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to voice that for the record that I think that this is something to be very, very alarmed about.
Thank you, Senator St. Nicholas. No further amendments by members of the body. Senators, this concludes our discussion on Bill number 157-34
Oh,
COR.
Mr. Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator Nelson?
I do have some amendments. I thought that we were discussing a future amendment that
No,
the previous
there was
speaker was
not
going to proffer.
there was not an amendment proffered by the
Okay.
previous speaker.
Thank
Any
you.
final amendments on Bill number 157-34? Senator Nelson, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment is to add a new section of the bill.
Is your amendment circulated?
We're going to pass it out right now, Mr.
1 minute recess. Senators, the committee in the whole is back in session. Senator Telena, for possibly the final amendment to this legislation, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is to add a new section 10241. So you just made that correction. To add a new section to 10241 to Article 2. And that reads, quarterly written reports must be submitted to E. Legislator en Guahan on status of capital improvement projects to include, but not limited to, CIP timelines, change orders, and costs. And the reason why I'm proffering this amendment, because if you look in the financials report on page 12, they recently talk about in April 2014, the port obtained a $10 million loan from BOG for the Service Life Extension Project. The notice to proceed construction work was issued on December 30, 2014 to take effect January 5, 2015, and anticipated completion within 360 calendar days of January 2016. Recent change order has extended construction to be completed in April 2016. And so this just requires further accountability, because we know that in any development or build, a change order constitutes money. And so this also gives us and gives the people of Guam an opportunity to see the shortcomings of some of the projects that were being awarded, and also the impacts of where their dollar goes. So, colleagues, I humbly ask your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Just for the information also of the body, if you want additional specifics prior to the enactment of this legislation, the autonomous agencies are mandated to not only provide monthly financial reports, but also during their board meetings, their board minutes reflect the status of all of their projects as it applies to any CIP. So I just wanted to highlight that. On the amendment by Senator Nelson, any discussion? Senator Esperon, you recognize.
Thank you. I have no problem with this amendment. It might be a redundancy in terms of what you just mentioned, Mr. Chair, that they already do have an obligation. But the only thing I want to say is that perhaps we should just let legal counsel insert this wherever and maybe create a new section, because under section 10240 in the bill before us, the title of that is construction of article. This does not address the construction of the article. This basically mandates that reports be given to the legislature. So if we could just perhaps let the legal counsel put it into wherever he might want it, might be most appropriate, then I think that'd be the wisest way to go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Esperon. On that motion or suggestion, the sponsor of the amendment has no issues or quorums. Senator Ada, on the amendment. Okay. On the amendment, no objections? So ordered. Senators, this has concluded. Yes, Senator Ada, you recognized initially.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, maybe if legal counsel could advise, but earlier there's a Public Law 30-57 which capped the port's borrowing capacity. And so I'm just wondering, do we need to put language in here that basically addresses the fact that this borrowing supersedes that borrowing cap? I don't know. I mean, I am aware that there's something about you can't. Otherwise, does this implicitly repeal that cap under Public Law 30-57?
Thank you very much, Senator Ada. What we will do is take a 3-minute recess and request legal counsel to please review your
Mr. Chair,
concern.
could I also ask a question?
For legal counsel also?
Maybe just you, In the interim, while we are waiting for legal.
Senator Ada, if you can please confer with legal counsel on your particular issue. Legal counsel, Senator Ada's request inquiring whether Public Law 30-57 will be directly or indirectly impacted by the possible passage of Bill 157-34. Vice Speaker Talai, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your indulgence. For one more question, I just want to be very clear. You know, the legislature's considering two bonds. One is a refunding or refinancing of GPA, and one is this Port Authority's bond. And I was noticing in the GPA statute that there's a provision that expressly states that the sale of the bonds shall be approved by the GPUC as provided by Title 12. And we understand, we were informed yesterday that PUC will be having a meeting on Tuesday to consider the ports, to look at this legislation that we passed and approve or not approve of the GPA financing. So could you just tell us for the ports authorities financing, the port is not on the PUC's agenda, only GPA is, and I'm wondering, this bill does not expressly say that this borrowing will be approved by PUC. And so I'm wondering, do we need to put that in? It seems inconsistent to me that we're not expressly stating that and that they're not on PUC's agenda for the next meeting.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. Because the question was posed, there was a statement that was provided by one of the port representatives during the early part of the week that alluded to, upon the conclusion of this particular legislation, that any bond borrowing, they would still have to proceed to PUC to be able to get their final concurrence and review. But let me verify that offline, and then I will come back to you. And I will ask that they specifically identify the citation. So
yes,
we will take a 3-minute recess.
Yeah, or would you object to specifically stating that in here, that they're going to seek PUC approval, just like the exact language that
Yes,
we do
the
for
actual
GPA?
citation. Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. 3-minute recess. Good afternoon, Senators. The Committee in the Whole is hereby reconvened. Senator Ada, if I can recognize you with regards to your issue. So you receive confirmation that the two. I'm sorry, can you please speak into the mic, Senator? Only because you publicly announced it, so.
According to legal counsel, we'll basically just follow the rule that the most recent law will trump the previous.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Ada.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Yes, Senator S. Davis, before I recognize Vice Speaker Talai.
Right after the Vice Speaker, I'd like to speak. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to put a motion on the floor to rise from Committee of the Whole with the recommendation. As I was saying.
Vice Speaker Talai, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Were you able to confirm whether we should include this language that we're going to be including in the GPA bill that affirmatively states that the sale of bonds shall be approved by the GPUC as provided by Chapter 12 of Title 12? They've represented it to us that they are going to do that, but for some reason we are putting it in the statute for GPA, so I think we should put it in the statute for PAG, the port.
Vice
no,
Speaker
only
Talai,
subsection E. I pass out a copy of GPA's bill, and subsection E is what I'm talking about, the part about particularly, well, I guess the whole subsection E. We say GITA,
Okay.
but this one says the Board of Directors of GITA.
You have copies, Senators. You have copies of the proposed amendment. It's just subsection E is going to be added as a new section. Is that correct, Vice Speaker? Or a new subsection?
I'm not sure where I would ask counsel to find the place.
Okay. Based on that caveat, Senators, the recommended amendment to Bill 157-34 to insert the words, "The sale of the bond shall be approved by the Board of Directors of GITA as provided by Chapter 50 of Title 12 of the Guam Code annotated, and the terms and conditions of the issuance of the bond shall be approved by the GPUC, Guam Public Utilities Commission, as provided by Chapter 12 of Title 12 of the Guam Code annotated." The chair did have a conversation with a representative from the Port Authority. They notified me that, in fact, as was stated a little earlier during the week, that it is part of their checkboxes in terms of prior to going to market, that they will be meeting with the PUC and making their presentation. But he also stated that the addition of a provision or a requirement should not hinder the floating of the bond. So, Senator Torres, on the proposed amendment.
I just want to emphasize also to that point that according to the PUC and the PAG Protocol Agreement 0901, the port must obtain prior approval by PUC by filing a petition seeking approval as to the use of bond proceeds. And the petition includes subparts also. 1, a detailed list of projects. 2, a description of each project. 3, justification and cost-benefit analysis demonstrating the need for each project. And 4, the estimated cost for each project. So if it suits the body, we can be more specific in our amendment to reflect that protocol that is already in place. I mean, it's just a recommendation, you know, and where I would suggest that the inclusion of this language come in is perhaps under section 10203, which is powers of the board, that it be added as a subsection C perhaps, because it flows in there in terms of the...
What page,
on
Senator?
page 26, approximately line 25, insert a new sub-item C. And that's where I would recommend is probably the most logical, where you would include the language that calls for obtaining prior approval by the PUC by filing a petition seeking
On that
approval.
suggestion, other than the caveat to allow legal counsel to insert the language into the proposed measure, now the recommendation is to identify or insert it on page 26, right after subsection B. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? Senator Nelson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify that because we're seeing another bond, the petition is necessary to be submitted to PUC and the cost-benefit analysis, which should have been done prior to the leadership of the port coming before this body to make this ruling, because then I think that would have cleared up a lot of the muddied water about the cost of the cost of the project, the cost of the projects that they intended to do, because there's no actual cost, because there's no design, there's no build, which is why I proffered that amendment to have timelines of the CIP, because there's really no plan in place at this time. So I just want to state for the record that we're kind of doing this backwards as it was intended, and I know there's been concerns mentioned by our previous speakers saying that, with this legislation there could also be an interpretation saying that in the future that we'd also approve other measures like increasing the tariffs and using that as a vehicle to move forward with certain interests. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson. Any further discussion on the proposed amendment? First of all, no objection on inserting it as sub-item C on page 26. No objections? So ordered. On the amendment as presented, no further discussion. Senator Vice Speaker Talai, if you would like to close. No objections? So ordered. Senators, there being no additional amendments, Mr. Speaker, there being no additional amendments to Bill number 157-34 COR, as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication, and as further amended in the Committee of the Whole, the Chair is open to entertaining any motion to rise. Senator Esteves.
Mr. Chairman, I make the motion to rise from Committee of the Whole regarding this bill with the recommendation to pass.
Thank you very much, Senator Esteves. Senators, the motion is to rise from the Committee in the Whole to report back to the main body, to the Speaker of the Legislature, acknowledging that with all on the action of the Committee on the Whole on Bill number 157-34 COR, as amended by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication, and as further amended by the Committee of the Whole, with a recommendation, with all amendments intact, with a recommendation to do pass. On that motion, no objections? There's one objection. All those in favor of the motion to rise and to report back to the body, as was previously stated, please signify by raising your hands. Nine. Motion passes. Mr. Speaker.
Senators, I realize, and I want to thank all of you for your patience in working through lunch. In as much as we've not had lunch, I'll recess until 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, are we still back?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to thank our colleagues for all of the activities over the course of the last 6 days with regards to Bill 157-34. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of Bill number 157-34 as substituted by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudication, and as further amended by the Committee on the Whole, that it be placed in the voting file with all amendments intact.
Any objection?
Just a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Does this impact? Are we in the Committee of the Whole right now?
Not. We're back up. I should be up there.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is an objection. All those in favor of it going to the voting file? please indicate. Passes. Recess until 9 o'clock on Monday morning. We'll do GPA and then we'll do the rest of the calendar.